Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel discussions on how Australian game creators are taking the world by storm. Australia does indeed have a rich history of producing pretty amazing games. We have, for example, Fruit Ninja, which has been downloaded more than 1 billion times, Noire, Antichamber, the Blob, and a whole range of other examples that I've listed in my earlier presentation. So I'm very pleased today to welcome to this panel today Nicholas McDonnell of Samurai Punk. We have Ben Lee from Blowfish Studios, and we have Anthony Lawrence from Mighty Kingdom. So why don't we start with an introduction? Tell us a bit about yourself and your studio. You know, how did you get started? What are some of the titles that you've made? Nick, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, my full name is Nicholas McDonnell. I'm the managing director at Samurai Punk and one of the co-founders. Our studio is coming on 7 years old, and we, unlike maybe some of the other people here, we started fresh out of the 2014 post sort of collapse of the industry. And none of us in the studio have any real experience. So we're now sort of forging our own sort of route. And so we most of us went to university, studied, got a job. Also, didn't get any jobs because there weren't many going at the time. And we started our own studio on that. The studio itself is best known for games like Screen Cheat, Feather, the controversial American Dream. And we're sort of to the bone like a PC console studio. We never really dabbled in mobile besides something very early on in our history. And we've sort of been able to survive and grow doing that for the last couple of years, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nick. What makes the American Dream so controversial?
So the American Dream is a game about doing everything that you would normally do in your normal life with guns, except shooting at people. So, and it is about the culture and the history of guns in the US. We made that for VR and put it out alongside some mass shootings, not by choice, just coincidentally. And it is a game that asks a lot of questions and asks you to, especially if you're someone who lives in that country, asks you to consider your relationship with firearms. And obviously, it came from a place of us as game developers making a lot of shooters. We made a shooter before we made that game, and we were trying to ask ourselves creatively, like, why do we have so many guns? You know, just on the whole, not just in games.
Thank you for the background information, just in case anyone was wondering. So before we go down the route of a Second Amendment conversation, let's just move on to Ben from Blowfish. Ben, tell us a bit about yourself and about your studio.
Sure. Sorry, yeah. So my name's Ben Lee, co-founder and now managing director of Blowfish Studios. We've been around for just over 10 years now. Started 10 years ago, myself and my co-founder, Aaron Grove, and essentially we had been working kind of in related industries, visual effects and just, 3D graphics programming, R&D. And then we decided, we wanted to try, I guess me and my co-founder, we had made games back at uni and together, just like on a hobbyist side. And, I think it was the advent of the iOS, the iPhone and being able to self-publish into mobile. So we just had a go at basically making games. And, there's this thing called Unity. It was like version 1.5 at the time we started. And it just enabled myself and, Aaron just to be able to make, a quality game with in a few weeks, I guess, and get it up on the App Store. And that took off. And, our first hit was Siegecraft on mobile. And from there, we've grown. We're nearly 30 people now here in Sydney. Got a few people overseas, and we still, we still making our own games, but now we've also pivoted into being a publisher as well. So we publish other developers' games, and we used a publisher at the start, and now we're publishing other people's, other developers' games and helping them, hopefully achieve what we were able to achieve over the last 10 years. So.
Yeah, and I mean, you quite literally started in your bedroom, didn't you?
Yeah, well, yes, it was. In my two-bedroom flat at the time, and it was actually on the dining room table. And I think we were there for quite a while. We were there for nearly a year, and in that time we grew to 10 people. So I had myself and 4 other programmers sitting on the dining room table, and Aaron and the 4 other artists were sitting in the second bedroom, spare bedroom. So, yes, it was Yeah, we did that. We did that till we found a place we could get to.
Great. Well, great success story there. We're going to explore that in a bit more detail later on. But before we go there, very happy to welcome Tony Lawrence here as well, who's the CEO of Mighty Kingdom. Tony, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself as well as Mighty Kingdom?
Well, firstly, Jens, thanks for the promotion. I'm the COO, not the CEO. However, I've been with Mighty Kingdom for about 3 years now. Formerly, before that, I was with 2K Australia. That was my first job in the Australian game industry as the head of 2K Games Australia. That's a fairly privileged position to be in this industry. In that role, I worked with some fantastic developers, contributed to the BioShock franchise in total, as well as Borderlands, the prequel, which I think is probably the most Australian game ever made, and I'll stand behind that. Mighty Kingdom has been around for about 10 years or so. It was founded by Phil Mays. Phil Mays has a similar background, and he started with some Australian studios making games with the likes of Lucasfilm, Star Wars kind of franchises. And I guess he started it again thinking, look, this app store and making games on mobiles is a new thing, and there's probably a lot of potential in that. Of course, since then it's become the largest growing segment in games in the world. So that's he was spot on there. Good picker of trends. Mighty Kingdom has been, I guess, a specialist in games for kids and I guess kids with a women or a lady skew. Since Mighty Kingdom was founded, it's had found a lot of success in the Shopkins range of toys and producing apps for that. That was producing games with a lot of puzzle elements and Endless Runner. Since then, we've used some of those same kind of games to look at other franchises or other clients such as Lego. And we work with Disney. We continue to work with those brands. I think one of our biggest claims to fame for us is able to monetize the children's market, which is pretty simple. But I think when Mighty Kingdom did it early on in the 2010s, it hadn't been done successfully before. Now it's fairly commonplace. We've moved to narrative-driven puzzle games in the last couple of years. Essentially, one of the things we found about children's games is that for some reason, the games were being picked up and played again around about 10 o'clock at night. Figured that wasn't the kids, probably their mums. So we thought, well, there's a market we could probably look at what we've learned from it and move with that. So we've released Wildlife, which is a bubble shooter with narrative, and we've just released another game with our partners in Canada, Yukon, which is a solitaire narrative-driven game, and doing really great.
Well, thank you very much for that overview. So for someone who looks at the Australian industry from the outside, it looks comparatively small. You might recall from a previous presentation that the FTEs in the Australian industry are about 1,300 people or so. And compared to other developed nations, the industry itself is comparatively small. However, there is a long track record of having released internationally successful titles, something that goes as far back as the 1980s, where Australia-made games dominated home computers through The Hobbit, for example, and it goes from there. So it kind of makes you wonder, why Australia? What makes Australian games special? Is there some sort of special ingredient? There's some sort of special sauce? That's something I would really like to explore a bit further. And Tony, you've been around the block the longest, if I dare say so. Having worked at 2K and having worked at studios of various sizes, what's your take on that?
I think there's probably, look, a couple of things. I mean, essentially, Australia is an advanced economy, and with an advanced economy, you have basically highly skilled people being available. We're also culturally a pragmatic culture. So essentially, we solve problems and we work out how to do it in the best possible way for whatever forum. So when you've got a highly skilled workforce, a highly creative workforce at that, and mix it with our cultural pragmatism, you get great results. I mean, we really do. And essentially, I think that's one of the key drivers of why we do so well.
So is it the Australian quality of just giving it a go?
Giving it a go, but more about, look, we've got limited amounts of resource, we've got limited amount of technology, we've got limited amount of understanding. Yeah, let's give it a go, but we're not going to stop until we've solved that problem and seen what we can do with it. And then, really, it's approaching that with humor, and I guess a lot of collaboration as well. We talk about mateship as a culture, and I think that really spreads into our pragmatism and how we look at the world and how we develop games, for instance.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, Nick, your studio is the youngest of the three that we have here, and you gave it a go straight out of uni. I mean, so do you feel what Tony's saying? Do you feel that there's a reflection of your own studio in that?
Yeah, I think 100%. Especially in the types and styles of games we work on, there's a great diversity. So I say we do PC console games, but none of our games are kind of alike. We did a shooter, we did a VR game, we did a strong narrative, it's like 4 hours long, and we did a game about being a bird. None of these games are sort of locked into sort of any framework. And we're really just trying to, show off what we're capable of. I think that like giving it a go, Tony's comments about comedy really struck with me, because like we strive to try to have like a sense of fun and comedy within all our games, even if it's not sort of clear in some of them. And then I think you can even look at like a Goose Game or the work Grace Bruxner is doing, a Crawl. There's a lot of indie titles that are like actually incredibly good comedy games, and it's funny that there aren't a lot of them out there, and a lot of them that are there and are doing really well are coming out of Australia. So I feel like that's a unique property that we have, especially from this explicitly creative side.
Yeah, thank you. And Ben, lastly, from your perspective, again, is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have a lot of thoughts, I guess, into why we might be doing, pretty well. For me, there's one way to look at it is, I guess, the system here, education system and culturally, we are highly skilled, but we also value creativity and innovation quite highly. So I think, like I said, we're taught to think for ourselves and problem solve, but that problem solving can take many forms. But it's always about, okay, we always kind of want to do. We're used to being the underdogs, right? So we always kind of want to do something that somebody else hasn't done, and not so much copying. But you always get inspiration or influence from something. But I think that's one aspect of Aussies just trying to do something different. Then I think, as we've been a publisher now for a few years, and one thing I have noticed that also might help us is, we are English speaking. It is the main kind of the language here. I think we don't actually take that into account very often, but there's so many game developers around the world right now. But as a publisher, one of the things we find is there's people making great games in all parts of the world, but they do come from non-English speaking countries as their first language, and they struggle with their marketing and their publishing and just being able to get the name, the word of their game out there. So I think us being that kind of merger of we're English, but we're very multicultural. So I think the people here are really well equipped to one, make the game a different game based on different culture, but then to sell it to the world, because we are English speaking that way. And we have, and we get along well with anyone really, like Americans and Europeans and Asians as well. So
yeah, I think I'd agree with you there, Ben, in the terms of not only just being a multicultural country with the myriad perspectives that we bring, and as you're saying, Nicholas, that will contribute to diversity, but we look at the world from our perspective from down here in Australia, in that we consume that culture, whether it be American or European or wherever it's from, and then kind of assume that and put it into what we're making in terms of games.
What I find fascinating about this discussion is that you'll find a lot of the themes that would resurface if you had a conversation about such things as Australian identity, if there is such a thing. Itself, it's a hugely complex topic, but some of the things that we've heard is giving it a go and pragmatism. We talked about the humor, the reverence, something that is often associated with Australians, going as far back as the Anzacs in the First World War and the way they interacted with the British superiors. We heard about the underdog and just trying to do something that no one else has done. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to see how, if there is such a thing as a national identity, it's kind of asserting itself in the making of games. Like, or am I going too far with that statement?
I wouldn't think so, Jens. I mean, I think what we find a lot, even when we travel, and we do travel as Australians, we kind of need to go and see the rest of the world, is that we're known for our brashness. We want to put our viewpoint forward. We're not too afraid of stepping forward rather than stepping back. And and that, I guess that comes in our attitude to trying to succeed. We won't take a backward step. We want to take a forward step. We want to be competing with the rest of the world because we see ourselves as part of the rest of the world. And I guess our Australianness says, well, why can't we be as good as, if not better?
Yeah, right. Fair enough. And I guess there is also not like some sort of, for the want of a better description, identity framework that would make it harder to make games of global appeal. I mean, it's if you know what I mean, like, and we're talking about the English speaking part. I mean, that in itself is already quite helpful in terms of, how language, I guess, transports certain sensibilities and outlooks, which then, and concepts which then translate into the making of games. I guess on one hand, it makes Australians sort of vulnerable for overseas content, for the want of a better description, but it also puts this country in a very good position to create games that are of global appeal.
Yeah. I think that there is also a bit of there's a struggle in that games is half of it is commercial and half of it is creative. So there's always that pull between those two, and you like you said, you want the successful games have the right balance of both, right? I think that's always a tough thing. And so maybe here I guess as game developers, I think we have a very strong sense of being Australian and what we bring to that table. But with regards to Australian stories, it's a little bit more rare, I think. Blowfish, we did a game for Stormboy, which is a great Australian story, and I think, but that just, we didn't set out to do that. It's just that the IP holders approached us and we did that, and it's turned out well. But I think if you look at movies and TV, I think with TV, because you have that local industry, you see a lot more Australian stories from TV. Music, music's very personal, so I think it's probably more personal than cultural where you're from. But then you look at from the movies section, it's like we make a lot of international movies here. There's a lot of Australian movies too, but the international ones are more successful. So I think with games, I think we probably could try to drive Australian stories a little bit more. There's been some great Australian stories out there in games. So it's just I think that might help. I guess with us creating our identity as well.
Yeah, look, good point and fair point. I guess you could also argue that an Australianness might also express itself in, for example, the humor that's embodied in the game. Nick, for example, was alluding to the Frog Detective games that demonstrate that quite clearly. Nick, can you maybe explain to the audience who are not familiar with those games, what they're like, and how that very Australian type of humor asserts itself in that?
I can't actually speak to that specific game. I haven't played it myself. But I think what the point that can be made is the referential or reverence for other cultures, or being able to reflect on the rest of the world as an outsider, whereas this Australia sits in that weird place of being part of the West, but not, right? We're always reviewed as a child, kind of. That allows us to reflect on the outside world in a much deeper way than perhaps someone in the US would. So, I mean, we're talking about Australian stories. You can talk about our history, which is important and needs to be told more through all forms of our media, right? And the truth that is not being spoken about there through our media. but there's also the current state of the way we sit into the world and how we feel, like that underdog impression. And I think that is reflected in those games. I guess like Goose Game is another good example where that game is quite a strange reflection on a little English countryside, but you kind of know that that personality of that character you're playing doesn't really fit in with that world, right?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, actually. I mean, some of the qualities that we just discussed, this whole notion of pragmatism and so on, do you think that that's also one of the reasons why the Australian industry is very good at reinventing itself? And I'm saying that with the view to, again, the history. You look at the GFC having a major impact on the Australian industry. Some of the bigger or the biggest developers had to leave the country. Exchange rates started to go a bit unfavorable, and yet a little while back, you had someone like Halfbrick making Fruit Ninja, selling 1 billion copies, Crossy Road selling more than 200 million copies. Do you think that some of those qualities play into that as well? This ability to constantly reinvent yourself?
Yeah, I think you didn't mention Firemint and Flight Control, and I think those studios were really on top of what was going on. They identified trends very, very quickly, and were able to really double down on that. I mean, you look at those games, the early mobile games, and I'm not sure if they succeed now. But back then it was using a new platform. It was doing something that someone else hadn't done before, and it also looked at the actual platform itself. So swiping and moving stuff around with your fingers was very, very new. They weren't trying to make console games on mobiles, which made them very successful. It immediately said, this is what the new trend in games is about on your phone. With the ubiquitous phone. Now we have billions of them around the world as a gaming platform. It's that ability to have a look at, well, what's different, and we're used to looking at things in a different kind of perspective anyway, and then applying what we know to those platforms. And that was done really well by some of those very early entrants to gaming. And we look up to them now still. No one ever is going to forget any of those titles, and they're still here today. So they're doing some things. I mean, Firemint has morphed into EA. But then again, we've seen some other studios return as well. I mean, we've seen other people like Activision who have recognized the great talents that we have in Australia and want to set up a studio like Sledgehammer here. So it's not just how we see ourselves, it's also about how other people see us. And they see us as we've discussed, people who make great games from a background of highly skilled, highly creative, and highly pragmatic. And I think that drum for it's really what sets us apart.
I guess for me, one thing I want to add is, I guess, it's kind of I think it's changing now with the size of the studios here in Australia. There's a few now that are growing, over the 100 mark and getting up to around 200, 300. But I think the way that we got here, the way that we got there in the Australian industry is probably why it's only just starting to happen again, because we were quite, I guess if you go all the way back, when it was kind of everyone was in indie, but then you got to the AAAs, and so we had the larger companies and the larger studios, and like you were saying, Jens, about they were kind of very much at the mercy then of the Australian dollar and external funding, and no government funding or support there. What that meant was, I think we had that kind of crash where a lot of those studios disappeared, and then where we started from there were these much smaller independent, much smaller groups, and even all the games that you've mentioned and the success stories, they are still quite small. And I think that's one of the reasons is because of the fear of, well, again, we don't have all this support. We are trying to think differently, and that's shown in how we've had those successes. But then once you have that, you don't want to then have the same thing that happened before and then go to really big without more support. But I think it is really great to see that those people were successful, and then some were picked up and made part of larger groups. People like Mighty Kingdom, Tony, and they're trying to again, like finding a way to expand, become bigger, not reliant on just overseas money or government money. And myself and Nick, we're still traveling down that path of trying to do what we can. Just with what we have. And I think that if you look at that whole journey, it kind of shows you why the industry in Australia is how it is with regards to studios and studio size. I don't think anyone really wants to take that gamble again of like, all right, let's just go take a lot of money from overseas and set up a studio and go from there. So I think it's part of it.
Yeah, I agree to a like extent as well, Ben. I mean, in that we have a bootstrap mentality, right? I think that the failure in Australian industry for around GFC time is the dominant business model was work for hire, and when work for hire, your exchange rate is part of your margin, and then all of a sudden, that's gone. It's completely non-competitive. What happened was that the skills remained, right? All the people who were here and making games just moved on over to different platforms, and we're still here making those games. But yeah, I guess it's not just a size model. It's a surety, and certainly to some extent market failure to some extent in that games is our understanding of games is fairly unsophisticated in Australia, particularly when you're looking for investment. Whereas we could have government to help us with that somewhat and help us grow. That hasn't been around, right? So we haven't been able to grow as fast as some of our contemporaries in other countries like Canada or the UK.
Yeah, I think that's why you've also seen a lot less Australian developers pick up large publishers that take on IP or chuck in a ton of money for these projects. At like our scale, there's a lot of small pools of cash flying around from overseas where you can pick up a publisher, make a small game, release it, and then get nothing back, basically, unless the game is a very large hit, right? And that would, like, if a studio like ours has survived on, I think, exactly that attitude that Ben described of, well, we were studying during all the collapse. We were at university during that period. We were just watching studios go down constantly. And we were just like, well, if that's what killed us, we can't do that. So we're reflecting that by, trying to keep all the IP and try to keep all the revenue on our dime. So even if a game that we make is not a mega hit, it's our title and we have full control and we can exploit that and grow it over time and sort of shore up like a sturdier base. And I think that's led to a really slow growth for our studio, which has been very intentional. But, we're still here and we plan to be here 25 years from now or 30 years from now. So whether or not it's going to lead to us being 100 people at a certain time, I don't know. But that is definitely reflected in the way we're operating.
One thing I think maybe the industry is missing in regards to, we're talking about how many hits come out of, or how many successes come out of Australia, is that there's actually a lot more now even than I think is even known, right? Like, I think, all of us, we continually just find these games that, just on Steam or mostly on Steam that are doing really well. And then you don't even know they're made in Australia because, these indie groups making them and then just getting busy and continuing to growing the game and making it. So I think that could be one aspect that would, I guess, help the industry as a whole, is if we could identify and celebrate, every small or any size success, I think. And I think, again, from that underdog perspective, maybe Australians also aren't so keen to, we don't really like yell. We're not, we don't extol our own, successes so much. And I think that is one of the reasons why there's a lot of kind of unknown successes out there, which, I think as a group, it should be great to help that aspect rather than force each and every one of us to have to do that, I guess, because that part is the un-Australian part. So.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ben. The forcing is definitely not what I'm going to do, but having the full ecosystem of those small studios through to the large ones is something that's very beneficial. You look across the road from me from Mighty Kingdom and then see the studio where Hollow Knight was developed. And that was 6 people at peak, right? And 2 to 3 people just normally. Whereas we're across the road here, we're at 90 people currently and still growing. And to have both of those kind of studios is really healthy, right? And it really is. I think we haven't talked about is the collegiate nature of the Australian games industry. I can call you anytime, Ben, and have a chat about what challenges we're facing if there's an issue and we have a chat about that. And that's the same with many developers in Australia. I mean, I'm sure you're the same, Nick. You've got to have people who you trust, and they're always willing to share information or knowledge or talk about the problems that they've faced that you're facing and how they got through it, and you can learn from that very, very quickly.
Yeah, before the pandemic, we are still part of the arcade, and that was a space in Melbourne that housed Jens. I think you could probably tell me more accurately. I think it was over 100 individual people in the building, but there's a multitude of studios as large as about 50 now, with League of Geeks getting pretty big. People like us were about 10, and then there's smaller as low as 1 or 2, and everyone's there over lunch, at drinks, talking, helping. We've collaborated with 2 different studios in that building. So we did a port for one and we did a co-development with another. There's just like no fear of knowledge sharing or like industry secrets. Like we're very happy, like I guess it's like an Australian mateship thing, but like just very happy to just help each other out, right? We have no feeling, even if a lot of us are in competing markets, we just don't have a sense, because we all feel like, I guess, we're competing with the world, not each other.
Yeah, very much so.
That's a really good point. So, I mean, so you look at the Australian industry, and you have this creativity, you have the talent, you have the mateship, you have the pragmatism, you have the humor, and so on. And it kind of makes you wonder, why isn't the industry bigger than it is? And one of the things that Tony, for example, alluded to is investment being a bit of a challenge. From your perspective, what are some other challenges that we've kind of alluded to some of them, but if we had to summarize it, what's your take on that?
I guess for me, one of the larger challenges is one of the bad things, or one of the many bad things that the GFC had, is many of the very experienced developers left Australia. Which means we've got a dearth of talent coming through the ranks, and certainly I'm more about encouraging that than a lot of people. So I guess that the really experienced people, the people who have done a lot of work over the 20 years before the GFC, for instance, left and didn't come back. So we're at a point now where we're all industry veterans now because we've been here for about more than 10 years. But the talent that we're bringing as talent we've built ourselves. We've built it from scratch, and that comes from watching the GFC talent pool move from around 2,000 developers down to 750 within a range of about 2 years or so. We're having to build from that base. Now, right now, we're back up to where we were just about from 10 years ago. So we're still in that building phase. And I think what I'd like to see is just that extra kick to push us up, to bring us forward. And I look, I guess, looking at games from a global perspective, which we all do, is I look at what the UK did. Right, they introduced a 25% rebate only 5-6 years ago, and what's happened there? You've seen an explosion of developers, you've seen an explosion of games, you've seen an explosion of investment, and that's in recent history. That's not going back to 1999 with Canada. That's going to 2015 with the UK. I think we're capable of that for sure. We're capable of bringing people home. Certainly, I guess the COVID experiences, I've seen a lot of people come home. But also we can have a start to build that skill set from go to woe. I'd really like to see that.
Yeah, I mean, you always, that's very true. And then, part of that, being able to bring them back though too, is that you're going back to the funding, or investment, but the funding is a large part because you can't build something without a team, and you need to pay a team to do that over time. And I think, most of us all, like I said, go back to that bootstrap thing. It's like, there's no easy debt. So there's no debt and then there's no funding. So what do? You have to, either you work out of your spare time for the first title and then you pivot, or you use savings. And so I think that just makes us all very, risk averse with how we've built our studios, trying to do it organically. It's not a bad thing. It's just I think that's one of the reasons why we are the size we are, because we aren't doing it through investment or debt. So it's one of those those questions. If we want the industry to grow much faster, then we need, not everybody, but certainly some companies or some places to do it another way, which is, again, Mighty Kingdom and Playside are great examples of that. So I think we'll be able to see that kind of add to the growth, at least initially, and hopefully that might, that will start a nice kind of new trend for inside Australia, at least anyway. And again, having some, I guess, regulations or laws that bringing people back skills wise, but pandemic, we can't do that. but maybe in a year's time, like I said, then we'll be able to start bringing the skills base back. And while we've always been, like you said, like Tony said, building up over the last 10 years, either ourselves or others, and just taking young graduates, or not even young, sorry, just people that want to make games. Because some people, there's a lot of people now just doing career changes that really 10, 20 years into their professional lives, and flipping over to games still too. So
yeah, the cultural force of games is certainly going. And, we're sort of slowly coming to the end of the conversation, and we've looked back quite a bit. We've discussed the presence. What I would like to do for the last couple of minutes is let's look into the future. Ben, you've already alluded to PlaySide as well as Mighty Kingdom have one thing in common. That is they are currently undertaking their IPO. Tony, is that where the journey is going? Is this a model for the industry as a whole, or?
Well, for some it is, for sure. And I think one of the great things that we've been able to do is going through that process, and PlaySide before us, is to start to educate the market of, this is what games is about. It's not a high risk industry. We actually have a lot of data to back up how our thinking is. We understand our markets. We diversify our business models specifically to not have all our bets in single places. We're all qualified. We've all run businesses for quite some time. I guess we're not just the creative artists that people think we are, betting all our money on a dream, right? We come from a background of being highly skilled, understanding all the things you do in any market. We're just applying it to something that people might not be familiar with. I think I came to games after a long history of not being in games, sure, in creative industries, and I think it's the best industry ever. The marrying of the commercial outcomes with the creative input. You can't beat that. You really can't if you're someone with a creative bent who loves playing with technology and ultimately being successful at it. It's a great industry, and I think Australia really promotes that kind of thinking. What can you bring to what we've got?
Yeah, thank you, Ben. What's your take?
It's, to me, there's a lot of unknowns where the future's going. The industry is just growing so much every year. There's always new technology. There's always new channels. For us, how we started, it was through the new channel, the iPhone and self-publishing. So I think, for us, we are just always keeping an eye on what's next, what's happening. Just being agile enough to be able to, make use of that to stay competitive with, globally, and always just trying to make, the reason why we started Blowfish was because me and my business partner loved making games, and like Nick said, we hope to be here, 25 years. I'll be pretty old, but no, but yeah, making games and being able to support the team that we're making games with. So it's very important.
Yeah,
Nick.
I think this kind of goes to, I guess, Phil and Mighty Kingdom's kind of thoughts on what we want to be doing as a studio as a whole, but that building up the infrastructure to support the bottom to top, sort of style of studio where you've got the AAA filtering people out back down into smaller studios and back up and forward, and you got multiple scales of studio throughout Australia where we're able to self-sustain as an industry, and we're able to build a range of titles here, not just kind of the stuff that a bunch of us have worked on so far, right? I think that's the dream, and it's going to require a couple of things to change, and a lot more money to come through the country to allow us to do that. Especially, the bringing staff back from overseas, and getting faith, both from investment and from people who have left the industry or left Australia, who are accepting that you can have your entire career. But when I started, I didn't believe that I could have my entire games career in Australia. And I think that needs to be a possibility. The way we go about that is about people like Mighty Kingdom, sort of showing us the way, I guess, and allowing, I'm trying to be as kind as I can, but really opening up the door so that, you know, the people who want to stay small can stay small. People who want to grow can see that, yes, there is a life that I can have here, and that we can have a full ecosystem. I think what we're trying to do as a studio is very different to a lot of what other people are trying to do. As we have that balance of like creative and business, and trying to produce the best kind of creative work we can whilst paying people and making sure that we survive. But yeah, for us to exist in that ecosystem, we need everyone else there as well. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add, because the bit about trying to get people skills back to Australia too. For us, the main, you know, because for any graduates or people looking to get industry listening and going to be watching this, it's like, the reason is that, you know, what we found is with a lot of people that we take on as graduates and juniors is we need senior people, we need mid people to train and mentor and give the right, you know, information across. So it's not like that's all we need to, like, you know, to bulk up. It's purely that we need a lot more people on the skill side to be able to provide the contemporary modern day processes and, you know, and yeah, just pipelines on how to achieve, you know, what the rest of the world is currently doing too.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Look, I think we've sort of reached the natural conclusion of this conversation, just looking at the time, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. I thought here, you know, it's a great overview of what the special sauce of Australia is in terms of, you know, the cultural influences of the country, in terms of pragmatism, in terms of mutual help, in terms of humor, in terms of creativity, and so on. So I would really like to thank Nick, Ben, and Tony for taking the time, for making themselves available, and for having this conversation. So thank you very much.
Cheers, Jens. It's been great. Love talking to my colleagues.
Thanks for organizing it.
Thanks all. Thank you.
All right. So here's an opportunity for you to ask some questions now. Thanks, everyone.